This is a resource of Just Loving God.
Culture of Love Part 1. Love My Neighbour. From Mark chapter 12, verses 30 to 31.
So today we're talking about the culture of love. And this will be a mini-series. This is part one of that series. And this one is entitled Loving My Neighbour. And our text for today is Mark 12, verse 30. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. When someone walks into your church looking for answers, what do they experience? Or when they walk into your home or your workplace, or they walk past you in the street, what do they experience? What vibe do they get from you? It's not something that should just be left. It's not something that you should fail to consider. It is something that is so important to loving your neighbor that I can hardly overstate it. And I want you to come away today understanding it. It shouldn't be that you just negligently assume they experienced what you thought they experienced. We don't get to do that. Do they come away knowing that they were loved and seen and heard? Maybe, just maybe, it's the last touch point with a child of God that person will ever have. We had a man come to this church a few months back. His friend had sent him, contacted me. My friend is desperate. He's suicidal. He's got a wife, he's got children, he needs help. I said, we'll be here for him. He came. I listened intently to him. I threw my arms round him. I prayed for him. I asked him to talk to Jesus in his own words. There's another man from the church. He was with me. He picked up that baton and he followed him up. He phoned him, contacted him. A few weeks back, he killed himself. You just don't know. Maybe it's just the last touch point they're going to get with a child of God. And what will that be like? You know, there's three types of neighbor. You could say there's two. There's a Christian and there's someone who isn't a Christian. But I think you could subdivide the second category. There's active enemies of Christ. But then there are genuine inquirers after Christ. And then there are Christians who are in Christ already. And I want to talk about these three different neighbors today. And we Christians have very, very specific instructions about how to treat each one of those three categories. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's our instructions. Now, if that person still goes away from that interaction offended, upset, angry, whatever, just make sure, and it better be because they were offended and angry with Christ and his cross, not with you. That better be the case. It better not be the case that you're just so needy that person couldn't actually hear that you loved them and listened to them because you were so busy trying to find your value in telling them something. People that walk into church are surrounded, immersed in, drowning in a world which does not place a high priority in loving your neighbor. Let's be honest. There is a problem in society. It is a devastating problem. Love and kindness for others is diminishing. Now, yes, there's pockets. In times of crisis, yes, we see people pulling together. Why? Because they're hardwired for this. But something is destroying this in the fabric of society. Humans were made for love. They were made to be loved. And they were made to love. So this disease is literally eating humans from the inside out. And it is the source of the deepest human suffering on this planet. So we better do something about that. I want to give you three satanic trends, just to jump straight into this sermon. I'm not ramping this up with a funny little anecdote. We've got work to do. 3 satanic trends that are destroying neighborly love. Number 1, there is a rise in loneliness and social isolation. And this is having a direct impact on neighborly love. Individualism is on the rise. We used to be far more collective. We used to be in clans and families and multi-generational units. We used to be in villages where everybody knew everyone and looked after everyone else's kids, could leave your door open. Even in my lifetime, that was the case. Digital communication is now replacing much of face-to-face communication. It really is. Even if they live in the same house. Social media is creating superficial relationships. Active listening is a lost art. People long to be heard. They long to be accepted. We've got more geographically spread out mobility. People are traveling, living other places. They're separating from their families. There's longer working hours. It's reducing community involvement. Urbanization, the concentration of human beings into these tiny stacks. And yet nobody knows anyone. There's a loss of gathering places. There is a relentless drive for an increased political and ideological separation, polarization. You're from the north, I'm from the south. You're from the east, I'm from the west. And therefore I fear you, and I'm suspicious of you, and I hate you, maybe. I certainly can't have a relationship with you. There is such a fear now of vulnerability, especially in relationships. It's downright dangerous. There's a decrease in religious involvement and commitment. This isolation reduces the opportunities to show neighborly love and concern. Disconnected people are less likely to engage in pro-social behaviors. Fact. And notice that this trend is inhibiting people from inquiring after Christ because they're isolated and they're fearful. Interesting. I wonder who's behind that. It's creating anger sometimes in people and bitterness that they are alone. So they lash out and they maybe become active enemies of Christ. That's the first trend. Second trend, there is a rise in hostility, both online and in person. You felt it, haven't you? The chill winds of hostility around us. Wars, rumors of a third world war in Europe, war in the Middle East, suspicion of others everywhere. The news is feeding this. Social media is feeding this perception. So it becomes a vicious circle. There's increasing political and ideological polarization, as I said, which leads to this hostility, this suspicion, this fear, this anger, this rage. You don't even know why you're angry, but they just don't agree with you. So what's the correct response? Well, I need to be against them. Research is showing that there is a massive rise in cyberbullying, in trolling, in hatred, and downright cruelty online. Online anonymity is feeding into this, because you don't have to put your face on there. You don't have to tell them what city you live in. This depersonalization in the digital space is leading to interactions which are cruel and distant. And the algorithms are enhancing this. They just give you more of what you've already got. There's less empathy. That's what it means. There's less kindness. That's what it's producing. There's less happiness. There's less connection. It's creating voyeurism. I want to see somebody failing, somebody getting what they deserve. I want to see disaster. There's cruelty, and it's destroying neighborly love. And this is not just happening by accident. There is a devil. And there are people who are truly, truly his servants. And it's divide and it's conquer. That's the motto behind this, divide and rule. And it's an ancient technique. We think Alexander the Great's son, Philip II of Macedon in the 300s BC, came up with this concept. But it's not him, in fact. You see, Jesus said a house divided against itself, what? Falls. And then what do? You come in and you mop up. If you're the devil, that's what you want. It's even worse than if you cause the house to divide against itself so that it falls, so that you can come in and rule. It's as old as the world, this. There was a snake once, came to the first woman, and he sowed seeds of division, notice, between her and her maker. Hostility, suspicion, fear, doubt, so that he thinks he can come in and rule. We've got the Samaritans. They were descendants of the northern Israelite tribes, taken into captivity by the Assyrians in about 722 BC. Some of these guys were left in northern Israel. So the Assyrians they shipped in a whole load of pagans to dilute the northern Israelites, divide and rule. Notice, they intermarried with these pagan immigrants, and they created a bastardized religion. There was nothing like the religion that God had instituted. Think of all the nations that have used this in their foreign policy. The Ottoman Empire, pitting the Armenians against the Kurds. Even Shakespeare in the 17th century wrote a play, Othello. He has Iago, this evil man, coming to this happily married man, Othello, whispering in his ear that his wife's having an affair, whispering, sowing doubt, until Othello's so broken-hearted and furious, he kills his own wife. That's what we see online. Think of the British Raj. Raj means rule in India between about 1850s and the 1940s. They went into India. They caused and they amplified divisions in the population there to prevent the emergence of the Indian Independence Party. Look at the US. Some people accuse the US of deliberately escalating division between the Shias and the Sunnis in the Middle East. Divide and rule. Think of the World Economic Forum. They're doing it right in front of our faces. It's not a conspiracy theory. They are actually fomenting hatred between different societal groups. On purpose, they're actually doing it. They're telling us they're doing it between different ideologies. And this is creating hostility in society. And that produces a reduced willingness to help someone else, to engage with other people who hold a different view. We must be different as Christians. This being immersed in hostility is stopping people becoming inquirers after Christ. Interesting. Third trend, decreased trust in others and in institutions and in churches. And even decreased trust of your own eyes. You don't know what to believe anymore. Distrust in absolute truth is an old problem. Sir Francis Bacon wrote an amazing essay on truth back in the 17th century. And he opens it with this: "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. But it's way worse now. The Edelman Trust Barometer, Edelman is a company that actually studies trust in the world. 2023, they noted widespread erosion of trust in governments, in media, and in businesses. Relationships, as I said, have become dangerous. There's so little trust now. And relationships, think about it, are now being funneled through a barrier. So much of our interactions are funneled through this digital wall. And this wall is not just a wall. It does things to our interactions. It feeds the other person on the other side of the wall what it wants to feed that person. Not necessarily what I wanted to feed that person. Interesting. And that wall itself is designed to create addiction to the wall. Something wrong here. It's designed to create connection, yes, but also shame and maybe coercion and maybe to destroy lives. Artificial intelligence, deep fakes. You can't even believe what you see anymore. Alterations to video. Is it real? I don't know. Little kid carrying a baby tiger. That looks lovely. Not real. Zero trust anymore. Video evidence is now being excluded in courts of law because they don't know if it's real. Without trust, people are more guarded. They're less likely to engage in altruistic actions because it's just risky. You don't know, maybe you're going to get sued. Maybe you're going to be rejected somehow. I know of a case where a man saved a woman from drowning. She sued him because she got hurt being saved from dying. It's dangerous. Maybe you're going to be shamed and ostracized and cancelled. Cancelled. The concept of cancelling a human being, that is pure evil. So notice, with this plummeting trust, fanned by hostile people who are against Christ, let's be honest, it's hindering people inquiring after Christ. And it's producing some who are active enemies of Christ. But, there's always a but, you know, because there's a great God. There is not just bleakness and death and hopelessness. God has a solution. And let me tell you, it's very good news. God gives new life. God gives new life-giving relationships with human beings and himself. Based on what? Based on reconciliation. The opposite of what we heard. Based on peace. Based on trust. This is the craving of every human. And he gives this beautiful, life-giving community. He calls it a church. And then he puts his healing Holy Spirit inside human beings. What is this? This doesn't sound like the world. And it all works by love. And this is answering the deepest longings and the deepest cries of the human psyche. We're all wired the same, you know. It's a love that's from God. It's not from here. And it's a love that flows back to God. When that fills up a person, it overflows onto the people around them, onto their neighbors. We are the vehicles of this love. Do you realize that? Do you realize the heavy stewardship that you carry? And this is why Satan is trying so hard to destroy this in society. He cannot have people in love with God. Because when they're in love with God, then they love people. Why do you think films, animated films like Up, are so successful? They're so timeless and appealing to the human condition. Why? What's actually being said in that film? Someone's identified this and said, I can make money from this because I know humans are hardwired for this. Interesting. You've got this reclusive, bitter old man, Carl Fredrickson. His wife Ellie's died. He loved her. And you got this little chubby Asian kid, turns up at the door. Russell. He's a Boy Scout. He's a wilderness wanderer. And he's after his last merit badge to help an old person. And he gets Carl. He sort of hates the nice little kid rabbiting on in front of him. Can't stand this little boy. But the boy just keeps on going. And in the end, he ends up in this great adventure going to Paradise Falls with Carl. And he shares at one point, and this is so crucial in the story, that he didn't have a dad. Begins to soften old Carl, who realizes he doesn't have a wife. They begin to bond. He begins to see the boy differently. Love is winning the day. Do you see that? In the end, he abandons Paradise Falls to save the boy. And then they come back and he attends his little badge ceremony. And he gives him a little bottle cap, the Ellie badge. Why on earth did that make nearly $750 million in the market? Because it touches this very thing that God has wired humans for. And he's given us, the church, the answer for and the calling to go. God's provided all this for mankind. And let's put it in a graphic form. Let's compare these three satanic trends with what God says. Let's look at it for a minute. Here's God's best for mankind: family, church, and connection, as opposed to the rise in loneliness and social isolation. In Psalm 68, it says that God sets the lonely in families. Instead of the rise in hostility, we see God's best for mankind is love and unity and forgiveness and sacrifice. Ephesians chapter 2 says this: for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Verse 15, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God. That's God's best for mankind. Instead of decreased trust in others and in institutions and in church and even in your own eyes, here's God's best. Love believes all things. There is absolutely certain truth in God, and you can stand on it. So God's whole character is summed up in this: love your neighbor. And he set the example. But Jesus didn't want you to be unclear about what it means to love your neighbor. So he told a story, a parable. Luke chapter 10, verse 25. A lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. He asked this question, who is my neighbor? Typical lawyer, playing with words, always missing the point. Jesus says in verse 29 that this man, desiring to justify himself, said this, who is my neighbor? Well, Jesus defines neighbor like this. Everyone. Sorry, I have had people who should know better look me in the face and say, no, this just includes Christians. That's my neighbor. That's who I should do good to. But how come then this was his enemy? So Jesus is saying, even someone who hates you. It's almost certain that Jesus intended to teach that the beaten up man was a Jew. Why do we know that? Because the road from Jericho to Jerusalem and then up the Jordan Valley, up to the north, that's the Jewish route. They did not want to go through Samaria. They went straight north from Jerusalem. That took them through Samaria, hostile territory. Jerusalem to Jericho went east and then north, or northeast and then north. So that was a Jewish route. Unlikely to find a Samaritan there. Strange that he was there. Probably a Jew. And as I told you, Samaritans, they're the descendants of the northern Israelite tribes, intermixed with pagans, false religion. The Jews hated them, despised them, mocked them, treated them like dogs. 2 Kings 17 tells us all about that. And Jesus is saying, I am telling you to lay down your life for enemies. That's where he starts. He doesn't start with the friends. He starts with the enemies. So how much more, then, would you lay down your life for someone who is genuinely inquiring after Christ? For someone who is already in Christ? You have no excuse for those 2 categories, do you? If you're to love the enemy, what can you say about the others? That's why Jesus started there. So he's saying, here's my principle, Samaritans. This applies, this love, to the stranger on the street. It applies to your colleague, whoever they are. It applies to the visitor to your church. It applies to the little posse of persecutors who actually hate you for no reason. It applies to the arrogant atheist who mocks you and derides you publicly. It applies to them all. Who is my neighbor? Everyone. The Samaritan chose to create this neighborly relationship with his enemy. He just chose to do that. And Jesus said, you go, and you do likewise. And another thing Jesus is saying here, I think, is that your neighbor is you, really. Just the same as you. Do you know what? That guy on the road is bleeding red blood just like you've got. It's the same as you. No, he's not. He's a Samaritan. He doesn't believe what I believe. He's got an evil religion. He's terrible. He's a mess. We shouldn't have it. No, he is your neighbor because he is you, really. That's who he is. He's the same as you. He's just like you. He's got the same human needs. He's got the same human longings. He's got the same human sins that you have got, that drove Christ to Calvary, to that cross. He isn't more culpable for Jesus' death than you. I suspect you're more culpable than he is. Do you not see yourself in your neighbor? If you do not see yourself in your neighbor, there's a problem. That's uncomfortable, isn't it? But they're so different, Lord. They're so bad. They're so wrong. They're so not right. Really? See this? That's a mirror. Have a look in it. It's called the Bible. Cry out to him for an understanding of who your neighbor really is. You cross the road to avoid the cross, and you cross the very nature of God. So, your neighbor equals everyone. Let me give you 6 ways to love someone. There's millions of ways. I'm just going to give you 6. The Samaritan did all of these 6, actually, in this, plus others. This story illustrates Jesus' expectations around loving someone. This is God himself telling us how to love someone. There's tons of ways, but I'll just give you these. And this was for an enemy, don't forget that. Okay? How much more? The other 2 categories. Number 1, actually care about them. You go, yeah, I know that, obviously. No, stop. Actually care about them. There's no technique that could possibly fake this. It's not possible. They'll smell you out. They'll know. They might not know why they know, but they know. You don't really love them. Proverbs 18:2 says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. The Samaritan lost what? Time. He lost resources, his oil, his wine, his cash, and he put aside his needs. He actually cared about the man, not about himself. He put himself aside. Ask yourself, do I actually do that? Number 2, non-verbal communication must match your verbal communication. You can't fake this because your body will show it. Proverbs 18:13 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. You're so busy talking and talking that you actually embarrass yourself and don't realize you've done it. The Samaritan wasn't like this. It doesn't say in this account, does it, that the Samaritan just talked the whole time? Doesn't say that. I suspect there's lots of silence because that man could barely speak, probably. This body language of ours, it conveys the authenticity. It conveys the empathy and the emotional depth. That's what it conveys. Whether you know it or not, that's what's happening. Another human needs to see certain non-verbal signals from you. They need to see that to believe that you're truthful. Eye contact, genuine smiles, how you sit, gestures, touch. It all speaks into this person's subconscious, and they're reading you. You say, whoa, well, how do I make sure then that my body language matches my words, and that they actually see then that I really love them? Let me give you the answer to that. Really love them. Don't worry about your body. I'll take care of it. Actually listen to that person. Be actually interested in them instead of what you want to say next. Number 3, it's the third way to love, empathy. Genuinely understanding. Genuinely feeling their position as best you possibly can. Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Does that mean you squeeze out a tear? No. It means you're feeling their sorrow. It means you're feeling their joy and you're laughing with them. The Samaritan actually felt this man's pain. He put himself in the man's position. He did for him what he would have wanted done to himself. That's what the Samaritan did. When he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him, notice, and bound up his wounds. He acted, he moved, he went, he felt. Do you see the empathy there? And active listening is, as I said earlier, a lost art. Amy Gallo in the Harvard Business Review defines active listening as this. It's when you not only hear what someone is saying, but also attune to their thoughts and feelings. It turns a conversation into an active, non-competitive, two-way interaction. So you're not so much just a passive sponge just sitting there silently, soaking it all in. You're more like a trampoline. You're reflecting back to them and amplifying back to them how they feel because you're feeling it. It's real. It's not a technique. That's active listening. You must practice reading subtle cues in people. Just stop your brain for a second. Zip your mouth and listen and watch and love. You then got to control your own emotions in that conversation. So it demands both empathy and self-awareness. Active listening is not something you're taught in school. It's taught the opposite. And all of this has got to flow from genuine inquisitiveness, genuine curiosity about that person. The priest and the Levite had no empathy here at all. They did what was easiest for them. They didn't feel his pain. That's almost psychopathic. Psychopaths have no empathy. You don't want to be like that. I hope. Number 4, here's another way to love. Unconditionally accept them as a person. Yeah, but they're so weird. They're so different. Genesis 9:6. Here's God's view on people. Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. All men, all women, all children, all babies from conception onwards are people in the image of God. The Samaritan put aside his ethnic and bigoted divide that existed between them. He just put it aside. He saw this as a human, a person. And he proved to be a neighbor to the man. He treated him as a neighbor. You know, people behave badly, yes. They do dumb things, yes. But they're still people in the image of God. Someone can nearly destroy their life utterly, totally, and they're still in the image of God. That image is broken in them, marred, yes, but it's there. So avoid any harshness. Listen, be inquisitive, encourage them. Here's a 5th thing you can do to love someone: forgiveness. Romans 12:17 says, repay no one evil for evil. Wow, that's hard, Lord. Well, what about the equalizer, Lord? He repaid evil for evil, didn't he? Didn't that person get what they deserved? Maybe. Well, that's not God's way. Not at this time. The Samaritan on that Jewish road, notice, he put aside any resentment for Jewish racism against him. Just put it aside. It's interesting. Verse 34 says he went to him. He bridged the divide. He made a bridge. Research shows that forgiveness builds stronger relationships. You say, well, that's obvious. Okay, well, try it then. It also improves mental health, forgiveness. Interesting. What do we see in the world? No forgiveness. Number 6, sacrificial love. John 3:16. For God so loved the world, not a bit of the world, all of the world, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. This cost the Samaritan a lot. It cost him time. It cost him a diversion. It cost him a whole night. It cost him money. It cost him resources. It cost him effort. He set him on his own animal. That animal probably had a saddle or some kind of, blanket or clothing over it. And that man's bleeding. He's filthy. Maybe he's lost control. He's become incontinent. He's putting this man on his own animal. He brought him to an inn and he took care of him. He took care of him. And the next day, he stayed overnight with him. Maybe he stayed up all night with the man. He took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him. And whatever more you spend, I will repay when I come back to you. This is God. That sums up God right there. He came to our roadside, broken, bleeding as we were. He picked us up. He put us on his own animal. It cost him everything. He stayed through the dark night of our sin and death with us, nursed us back to health, gave us a new heart and a new spirit. This is God. This is exactly what Jesus did for you. And we want to be imitators of God as beloved children, don't we? Luke 6:35 says, God is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Okay, I can just about manage the ungrateful, Lord. But the evil? Now, apply these 6 principles to the loving of your neighbor and see what happens. Actually care about them. Non-verbal communication's got to match. Don't worry about that, it will. Empathy. You've got to genuinely be there in the ditch with them. You've got to unconditionally accept them as a person. Precious soul. Forgive them if they've wronged you. And show them sacrificial love. So let's come back to these 3 types of neighbor. The active enemies of Christ. The genuine inquirers after Christ and the Christian. Let's look at the enemies. My enemy neighbor. We Christians have, as I said, specific instructions to love our neighbor. Jesus starts with the enemy, so that's where we start. If you lay down your life and your time and your energy and your money and your effort and all of your heart for an active enemy, you have no idea what might happen there. You have no idea what God could do. The Samaritan loved his Jewish neighbor who despised him. Richard Wurmbrandt, he was a Romanian, was a Jewish man, came to Christian faith, became a Lutheran pastor. Back in the 50s, after the Second World War in the 40s, the Russians came in to Romania. They took over. Communist. These soldiers never heard the name Jesus. They don't even know who he is. Never heard the concept of religion. There's Wurmbrandt there. He's preaching Christ with all his heart. They arrest him, 14 years in two different spells in prison, much of that solitary confinement, all of it torture, proper torture. Electricity, knives, beatings, like stuff you can't imagine. And as he was being beaten, the guy would come every day, take him out the cell, strap him down, start with his feet, beating the soles of his feet. Beating. Can you even imagine what that's like? He can't even scream anymore. With all his heart, he looks at this man who's just dead-eyed. And the love of Christ comes out of him. He can't speak, but he looks at him with love. One day, his abuser came to him and he said, Mr. Wurmbrandt, this is actually from his autobiography. He had not called me Mr. before. How is it that you love me? I would never love someone who put me in prison and beat me up. How can you fulfill such a commandment of Christ? Richard answered, I am not fulfilling a commandment by loving my enemies. Jesus has given me a new character, the main feature of which is love. Just as only water can flow out of a bottle of water and only milk out of a bottle of milk, so only love can flow out of a loving heart. After his release, Richard met a man called Borilla. Borilla hated Jews. Both Richard and his wife, Sabina, were Jewish. Borilla had slaughtered hundreds of Jews in Romania. And they were certain that he had also slaughtered Sabina's mum and dad, sisters and brother. Richard ran into him one day after his release. And he said to Borilla, my wife Sabina will forgive you. He said this to him, if Sabina, who is a sinner like us all, can forgive and love like this, imagine how Jesus, who is perfect love, can forgive and love you. That's what he told Borilla. Only turn to him, and everything you have done will be forgiven. That man fell to his knees and wept and repented. And he was saved that day. Richard woke up Sabina. He said, come. There's a man you need to meet. She came into the room. This is Borilla. You can imagine, can't you? Entire family wiped out by that man. She walks over to him. She throws her arms around him. She said, I love you. The guy was saved that day. And Sabina and him and Richard, they're in glory together. That is something. Luke Kennedy, a lovely pastor down in Brisbane, Australia, he tells this incredible story. He's one of 11 siblings. He was young, maybe 9, 10. His older brother got in trouble with the law, went to prison. He's in there, and then he gets out, and then he is brutally murdered in a gang situation. And the family's just ripped to pieces. The father fell to the floor when he heard the news. And then the news crews, of course, came, and some idiot newsman said, do you have a message for the man who murdered your son? And all the kids are watching, the wife's watching, and this man said, I want this man that murdered my boy to know I forgive him. That changed the trajectory of this whole family forever. They were never the same again. And many years later, one of his sisters was at an event, and this man walked over to her and said, are you so-and-so's brother, the murdered boy? And she said, yes. He said, I need to tell you something. I was his prison guard when he was in prison. Every day I preached Christ to him, and he came to faith. They didn't know that. They were amazed. This guy Luke was there as well. There's tears coming down their faces. He said, no, there's more. I am now the prison guard of the man who murdered your brother. And I've been preaching Christ to him every single day, and he's come to faith. And they all wept together. That is the love of Christ. That's the love of God for neighbor. That only God can do in a soul. I can't do that. I want to kill him back. I want to hurt him back. But he says, no, I died for him. Luke 6:27, Jesus says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. Verse 35, but love your enemies and do good and lend and expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. That's what Luke, the pastor, learned from his father. So we may be the only hope that our enemy has to discover the love of Christ. Maybe it's just you. Maybe you're the only hope they have, actually. You don't know. Maybe your response is the only thing that could soften that hard, brutalized heart and cause them to open finally to their Creator. Maybe it's only you, the one they hate. If I truly have seen the horror of my own sin, and few have, and I have truly humbled myself to admit that I am a vile sinner who needed mercy, and I walk in that, then I can love my enemy, who's actually no worse than me. Because actually I see myself as far worse than him, because I know what it did. I cry in my soul, what have I done? I slew the Lamb of glory. I did it. So that's the first type of neighbor, your enemy neighbor. I'm not going to deal with the third type, your Christian neighbor. I have preached my spleen out about loving one another, about forgiving one another, about walking in love, about fighting to maintain unity, about laying your life down for each other. I'm not going to repeat that. Go and listen to them. Read your Bible. Do what Jesus says. Let's talk about the other one then. What about my enquiring neighbor? There are scores of ways, I've said before, to love someone. But if you can just do these 6 things that I mentioned earlier, actually care about them, actually, with all your heart. Just don't worry about your body language. If your heart's right, it'll show. Have some empathy. Unconditionally accept them as a person in the image of God and forgive them and sacrificially love them. I tell you what, you will change lives. You will. Every single visitor to your church who is inquiring after Christ has been beaten, has been destroyed in some way, has been wounded and hurt by this broken, sin-sick world. Every single one of them. Every single one is tired. They are weary. They are heavy laden, every one of them. Doesn't matter what they say, their soul is burdened down. Every single one of them scared of something. Every single one of them has got hopes and dreams just like you. Every single one of them longs for rest and just longs for peace. Give me peace. Every single one of them is crying out inside for love and for friendship and for acceptance, without exception. Every one of them is thirsty for they know not what. But out of your belly flows a river that can quench their thirst. And not one of them needs another beating when they come into your church. Not one of them needs a second sermon in the same day. Not one of them just needs educating. They've taken a huge step to be here, to be in your church. Empathize. They've already felt the effects, the horrific effects of this rise in loneliness and isolation. They feel it. They're already exhausted by this rise in hostility. Why is this world so hostile? They come in with decreased trust. Just know that. They don't trust easy now. Honestly, why should they? They don't trust institutions. They don't trust churches. They don't trust Christians. They're unsure if you're genuine. That's what they're thinking. Are you really? Really? Are you? Honestly? Do I dare open anything to you? If these people meet children of God who actually care about them, in peaceful, joyful, honest, listening love, do you know what will happen? They will eventually be like that little snail, just beginning to poke its head out again, and then its little eye stalks. And you touch its eye stalk, and it goes back down, and it pulls back in. But gradually, they'll come back out. Gradually, they'll be like that beautiful tulip, just beginning to open to the first warmings of spring. It's been winter a long time for them. You don't know, all concealed with a smile, and all the jokes and all the banter. But inside, we're all the same. We bleed the same color blood. And they will respond. So let me pull this together. Just remember, the brutalizing restlessness, the noise, the screaming hostility of this world. You feel it, and everyone you meet feels it. So instead of thinking about you, think about them. Put yourself in their shoes and give the kind of compassion that all three types of neighbors desperately, desperately long for. Give it to them. The same kind of compassionate love that you would want if you'd never had it. Think of it. If you visited someone else's home, if you visited someone else's workplace, if you visited someone else's church, what would you want to experience? I can't count the number of times people have come in here and said, I've been at some church for a year and not one person has ever said hello to me in a service. I don't understand. Men, women, youth, kids are so desperate for love. They are so desperate for trust again. They're so desperate just for peace. They're so fearful. They're so lost. They're so lost that they're even turning to virtual AI companions. This is the desperation of humanity. I know of people committing suicide because their relationship with an AI bot broke down. What has happened? They're turning to substances. They're turning to multiple sexual partners, desperately trying to find this thing called love, safety. Well, they're turning to video games, played with equally lonely, desperate people across the other side of the world. And they're told that's friendship. Or they throw themselves into becoming a millionaire or a published author, just aching for value, aching for meaning. And then they pluck up the courage to walk into a church. Think about what that took. They see and they hear things they never saw before. They see other humans worshiping with all their heart this God that they talk about. What is this I feel? What is this I see and hear? Imagine it from their perspective. They see these people, strange people, loving one another. What is this? Is this real? But then somebody walks up to them at the end of a service and starts pontificating at them, starts pressurizing them, starts telling them, you've got to sort this out, you've got to sort that out. Confirming all their worst fears, actually, that, church is no better than this awful world that I live in. It's no better at loving. It's no better at hearing. It's no better at quenching my desperate thirst. It's no better at taking away the pain of this cancerous soul tumor that I have in here. It's no better, so I won't come there again. Remember, 1 John 4. Dear old John says this. Anyone who does not love does not know God. Because God is love. Take that to heart. I hope your heart is crying out to God right now. How do I love everyone around me, God, like you do? How do I do that? Help me. This is what I want with all my heart. I want to be like you. Here's some good questions you can ask yourself. Do I really understand the horrors of my own sin and thus the glories of amazing grace? Do I? Do I really? Have you cried out to God until he showed you this? Am I prepared to lay down my whole life to see people saved? Am I prepared to forgive my brothers and sisters in Christ so I stand a chance of forgiving my enemies and winning them for Christ? Will I choose to die to my own neediness in order to meet the deepest needs of my neighbor? Lord, I need to know your love for human souls. I need to know this love in my heart. I want to love the Lord my God with all my heart and with all my soul and with all my mind and with all my strength, and love my neighbor as myself, because there is no other commandment greater than these. Just pray out loud this prayer from Ephesians 3 with me. Please, Lord, read it with me, according to the riches of your glory, grant me to be strengthened with power through your Spirit in my inner being, so that Christ may dwell in my heart through faith, that I, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that I may be filled with all the fullness of God and be poured out for the poor lost souls who come to my door. Amen.